those. Up next, we're going to be talking about a lot of the questions actually that you were asking just now were about a little bit about inclusion, right? That question about culture touches on this. So inclusive cellular agriculture engagement. For us to deliver on this promise that we talk about of building a more just food system, we have to sort of look past the technology and think about how to responsibly usher it into the world. And so that means not wreaking havoc on the lives of people who depend on animals culturally and for food and otherwise. They use salmon as an example here. I'm not going to give away their whole panel, but I think you're really going to enjoy it. So this panel is moderated by Dr. Yadira Tejeda Saldana. She is New Harvest Research Collaborations Director. She's going to be joined by Dr. Bowness, Dr. Varsha and Dr. Aryé Elfenbein. Did I say your last name correctly? Oh, thank goodness. Okay. Folks, please welcome our next panelist to the stage. I know you're going to love this one. Just if you need it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Yadira, and I'm one of the research directors at New Harvest. So today, we're talking about big questions. One of that I've heard quite often is about the social implications of cellular agriculture. So I'm really super excited to be moderating this panel today. For the past year and a half, New Harvest has been collaborating with that team at the Food and Agriculture Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley in Canada to address this question. I believe that if we want cellular agriculture to deliver on its promises of being better for humans, animals, and the planet, we need to look beyond the technology and think about how we are going to implement it responsibly. So a few months ago, together with the FAI team, we organized a workshop. The event hosted indigenous people and elders, conventional agriculture stakeholders, nonprofit, select developers, and social and STEM researchers all in one place. So this panel is going to be the first time that some of the attendees are going to share their experiences during this event. I'm actually not going to give any more details, and I better pass it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and share their motivations to join the workshop. So let's start with Evan.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, folks. Super nice to see all of you here today. I just want to start, before I introduce myself, I just want to recognize that this conversation is taking place on the territory of the Lenni Lenape peoples. And I took a look this morning on the Delaware Tribe of Indians website, and on the site, they mentioned kind of the traditional foods of the people that lived around here were pretty diverse, but they came from the land and they came from the water. And so, you know, it was fish, fresh fish from the rivers and lakes. It was also wild plants and mushrooms and berries and nuts. And these are foods that were gathered, and they came from this place. And I just wanted to quickly mention that because traditional and indigenous foodways come from the land. And the food system has really changed that relationship in a lot of ways for lots of communities, but lots of communities still live in connection and dialogue with the land. So just as a reminder that as we introduce these new technologies, as new food systems come online, it does affect the people of the lands where those technologies are coming and where those food systems are coming. So I just wanted to kind of start a little context about that. I also just want to recognize that I'm coming from the land of the Stalo people in what's now called British Columbia in Canada. My name is Evan Bowness. I'm a postdoc at the University of the Fraser Valley. And I'm also one of the co-organizers of an event that we put on with New Harvest and others to talk about this very topic, the social and cultural and political and ethical implications of cellular agriculture. I'm also one of the editors of a special issue in the journal Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, which is going to be coming online really soon. There's already an article up there if you want to take a look, but this is going to focus specifically on this topic. So thanks again for being here, and I'll pass it down.
Hi, my name is Varsha. I am a postdoc at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which is on the ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute peoples. And I am a chemical engineer. I have my PhD in chemical engineering, so this is yeah, I mainly frequent STEM circles, I'd say. So I put cells into hydrogels and scaffolds and measure what they do. And on really good days, I can generate images like this. So I'm quite new to both to cellular agriculture and to kind of think about some of the social implications. But for me, I became really interested in cellular agriculture during the pandemic. And while my interest in cell ag was growing, I was also, my interest in virology was growing and epidemiology and public health. And I really became someone that was like helping my family really kind of go through a really tough time. And when the vaccine came out, there's something really striking to me about just the hesitancy that a lot of people had. And I think it was like really driving home to me that just creating a technology isn't enough and isn't going to be enough and isn't going to cause the changes that we would like to see. I think the people in this room would like to see. So yeah, like I said, I'm admittedly pretty new to this, and I'm just excited I was able to attend this workshop that Evan put on, and I'm excited to share my perspective on these topics as a researcher.
Thank you, Varsha. Aryé.
Hey everyone, I'm Aryé. I'm a co-founder of Wildtype, and I think my story of being drawn into indigenous engagement started in a very different context. So even though I don't always speak as though I am, I'm Australian and grew up in Australia. And during medical school, I had the fortune of spending time at an infectious diseases clinic in Arnhem Land, which is land that was given back to the indigenous communities of Australia. And really, it was just one of the most profound of learning experiences that I could have imagined within the context of a medical education. I was able to see that the traumas of colonialization were still very much pervasive, that so many of the deleterious consequences of policies that didn't involve engagement really had torn many of these communities apart. And I think it's from that place of understanding and curiosity that my journey and just passion towards indigenous engagement in what we're going to describe in the current context really began. So I'm really looking forward to being part of this panel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing that experiences and kicking us off with this panel. So, okay, so the title of the panel is Inclusive Cellular Agriculture Engagement. I'm really curious to know from your perspective, what does inclusive engagement mean, and why do you think we need it in the field of cell ag? Evan?
Oh, are we going to go down the line? Okay. So one thing I didn't mention is I'm an environmental social scientist. I'm a sociologist, so I'm always kind of curious about inequity in the world. One thing that's pretty exciting about this industry is it's just starting. So you can plan to integrate considerations around things like how do we address existing inequalities in the food system into the industry before it happens. So it's kind of a moment of planning for a possible intervention, which is really exciting. Whereas the food system that currently exists is rife with social inequity. It's got all kinds of problems. Racism, sexism, and class inequity are just kind of the basics, right? This is a highly unequal and highly problematic food system. And as these new technologies or new approaches get introduced, they can, be done in a way that's committed to a more sustainable food system. But then you can also plan that if that actually works out, how do we make it also more just? And I think that thinking down the line, thinking on that 50-year time horizon for when cellular agriculture is successful and scaled, how do we make sure that the existing problems in the food system aren't reproduced?
Yeah, I think for me, inclusive engagement means that we talk to and interact with people, communities, industries that cell ag could impact their life and their livelihood. So I think that requires a lot of engagement, a lot of trust building, and I think that it's going to be beneficial for our future and the vision that we have if we start talking to everyone now.
Yeah, I mean, I'd only add that I think with that engagement comes a responsibility from companies like ours to understand that there is no universal truth when it comes to our relationship with our planet, that there are a lot of metaphorical truths, that there are a lot of cultural protocols that we should respect when we start this process of engagement. And I think just painting a vision of what that future means is where it begins. I think it's such an easy thing to say, and I think that like so many other difficult things, it's in the execution and in creating this in a truly meaningful and authentic way that sometimes we get tripped up with. And so I think that what the and understanding that this will be an ongoing dialogue. There is not just one indigenous perspective. This is something we need to really sort of encompass so many of the different values, the different ways in which we see the world and the planet together, that this is going to be a long, ongoing process, and one that's really exciting when you can learn from the perspectives of those who you're not working with directly every day.
Can I just add something to that? A couple things that just kind of sprung to mind. One of which is that I'm realizing that this is the first time that I'm speaking without speaking notes in front of people, and so I need to go back for a second and just mention that I'm a settler. I'm as what Canadians call settlers. I'm non-Indigenous, so I just wanted, that was supposed to come in my bio introduction, but I missed that. So one thing, and then second of all, I didn't define engagement, which was the point of the question. So I'd like to just say that engagement for me is actually, and it builds on what Aryé said, there's a responsibility to kind of pay back for the things that we currently benefit from. And what the food system that we currently benefit from depends on a lot of people that are excluded from those benefits. And if you think about it that way, those people who are able to benefit from new technologies, new things that are being introduced, have a responsibility to look back to see who was left out. And so I think that is where that engagement comes in. It's a responsibility to find out who's being left out and how can the benefits be better distributed, or how can the risks and benefits be more equitably distributed. So it's kind of a gathering of information, and it's a responsibility to do so.
I love that. Thank you so much for bringing that back, Evan. So I have another question. We've been focusing a lot on that technological cellular agriculture. But from your perspective, are there any potential negative social implications coming from adopting CELAG as part of our food system? Anyone wants to start? Varsha?
I'll just say, I think that technology can be hurtful or harmful. I think every technology, can be hurtful or harmful. So I think it's a spectrum. And I think really how we interact with it and how it gets introduced into our lives and into our systems at this point is what determines kind of where it is on that range of harmful or hurtful. But specifically, some of the things I worry about with CELAG is really the lack of accessibility. Both of the product itself, like who's going to be able to interact with it, who's going to be able to eat it, that type of thing, but also just as a scientist, these are pretty complicated procedures, and how is that scientific knowledge going to be accessible? Who gets to decide what we make, how we make it, where it gets made? And I think, I guess how we go about that will be telling, and I think that is one of the ways that it could be really negative.
Good point.
I can speak a little bit to some of the themes that we talked about during the workshop that we held in April, and we kind of had 2 different days. One was focused on tissue culture salmon, and then another day was on precision fermentation and dairy. And so one of the ways that, as thinking about social and sustainability transitions, thinking about when something gets introduced, it can have harmful implications in the form of disruption, right? So that's what a lot of folks in this room are aiming to do, is to disrupt the existing industry, but there are people in that industry that depend on it for their livelihoods. So there's going to be harms in that sense, and it's kind of inevitable, and it's part of any sort of socio-technical transition. So in the case of farmers, when new dairy products or fermentation dairy products and animal-free dairy products come on the market, their livelihoods might be at risk of that. So this is like an inevitable part of change. So this is why we use the language of the just transition in the research that we're doing, is that these transitions are needed, but we need to find out who's going to be impacted negatively by them and how can we design policies or programs that'll help support those at most at risk of harm. Now, the dairy industry is an interesting kind of case study for us right now because that language of the just transition, and I'll just maybe define it. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it comes from the labor movements involved in the transition from coal to clean energy technology. So this is a transition that's needed, and it's a change that's going to and is already affecting workers in the coal industry. So the idea of a just transition came from protecting coal industries and coal industry workers and coal-dependent towns from the harms of changing away from coal production. And so in the case of dairy, it's a very similar kind of story. We need to phase out dairy cattle and cattle, and for climate reasons, similar to with the coal industry, and that's going to harm some of the people involved in that current animal agriculture industry. So in this case, dairy farmers. So that's one kind of example of harms. But for this panel, I'd like to also just bring us to the example of threats to culture that happen as as changes happen in the economy. And so one example that I like to point to is the idea of languages that are at threat right now. We know that globalization is causing threats to indigenous languages. And so as that's kind of, becoming more and more, there's fewer and fewer of these languages, places to protect them. The need and the responsibility to protect opportunities for resurgence comes along with the development of the technology in my mind. So there's a bit of a responsibility here to protect things that are going to be changed in cultures as a result of the introduction of new technologies. So.
I mean, the only thing I'd add is that I think starting in a place like this, we actually have an opportunity to do this differently. And I remember from a New Harvest conference a few years ago, the artist Oren Katz was speaking to the group and saying, the same language that you're using to describe what everything that this technology can solve, that's the same language that was used by the advocates of factory farming in the 1950s. We're going to address this problem of food shortage and have meat on every plate in every American household. And what he was saying was to not speak with hubris, to really recognize that this technology has consequences beyond perhaps what we envision when we are first creating it. And I think that the recognition starts with dialogue like this, but we also truly do have the chance to curtail that, to have it introduced in a way that does have inclusivity, not as an afterthought, but as part of what we've done from the beginning.
Thanks, Aryé. And Evan, you touch on something that really links well to this next question about how cellular agriculture could affect the livelihoods of farmers. And something that I've heard a lot is about how CELAC could replace animal agriculture. But do you actually think there is an opportunity for different paradigms to coexist within our food system? Anyone?
So with the case of dairy farmers, we're looking for dairy farmers who are interested in kind of the both and rather than the either or. So some dairy farmers that we've been able to talk with are interested in demonstration advanced fermentation projects on their farms as a way to kind of be like, you can produce milk in a cow and you can produce milk like this. So you can have these parallel processes happening on a farm as one way is to kind of ease the shock of the change that might be happening and to get the dairy sector on board because they're very politically organized, especially in Canada, and kind of buy-in from them is going to be necessary. So that's one way of envisioning kind of parallel or aligned ways of doing things within the food system where cellular agriculture becomes one way, but it can coexist along with kind of more traditional or conventional approaches. That's kind of the dairy example. Now, I guess the other thing that we've been talking about and has been part of the conversation that we've been having with Wildtype and folks that attended the workshop is how do you integrate more disparate worldviews. Like in the case of some indigenous communities who have quite a different relationship with something like salmon, and kind of, you know, the cellular agriculture and the industry who see it differently. Like there's just kind of an incongruence or a different way of seeing the world, and whether or not those two things can happen simultaneously or alongside one another is like a big question, how we do that ethically. And for those of you interested in this, the concept that's being used most often is the idea of braiding. So braiding Western and indigenous knowledges together. This is kind of typically it's a very unequal relationship, but it is something that we can strive towards and learn from some examples of, you know, indigenous scientists that have lots to say about it. So that's kind of, there's two different examples that we can kind of pick apart a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight those two parallel processes.
Yeah, and I'd like to focus on that you know, example of salmon as a great case study. And in our engagement with the indigenous communities that Evan described, I wasn't aware of some of the relationships that these communities will have to salmon specifically. And for some, salmon is considered kin, like a brother, sister, or friend. And there's something really special about the life cycle of a salmon. It's something that I've been fascinated by from the beginning of Wildtype, just understanding how this incredible animal spends its early days in freshwater streams, goes out to the ocean, travels thousands of miles sometimes, and somehow is able to find exactly where it came from to spend its last days in the same stream in which it was born. And there's something about that traceability or that kind of consistency of coming back that becomes a very special relationship that between salmon and the indigenous communities. And I think when members of these indigenous communities have visited Wildtype, one of the first, I'd say, impressions was that doesn't exist in the same way. So salmon are honored for the sacrifice that they make when they come back, and they are so sustaining to the forests and also to these communities. And this wasn't present in the ways that you know, we grow ourselves. And it was actually through conversation around this, you know, where our scientists were describing actually, you know, the process of growing these cells is one where we spend years just trying to understand the lives of these cells, of what makes them happy, how they communicate with each other, what enables them to grow together, what makes them unhappy, and how can we sustain their livelihood. I mean, anybody who's worked in a cell culture lab, I'm sure, has come in on nights or come in on weekends or worried about the health of a culture. And there's a degree of respect and reverence that we have for the lives of cells in this way. And you know, the scientists describing this, we were actually able to find such a commonality in terms of, you know, like respecting how beautiful these different lives are, whereas, you know, it just seemed like so much of an abstraction otherwise. The idea of cloning the cell of somebody who is a friend or, you know, seen as kin was so abhorrent in some ways, and yet you know, these kinds of ways are in which the paradigms are so similar. And I think that kind of understanding is where a lot of this work begins. And the salmon, you know, the story of salmon, I think, is one that's even more important when we think about the history, where the streams used to be so full of these salmon that indigenous communities have described it as a writhing snake of just salmon coming upstream, and one that was so dense with salmon that you could imagine walking on the salmon across the river, and how today there are just so few left. And when we think about, you know, wanting to, you know, take the pressure off the oceans in this way and have these salmon species just give them the opportunity to regenerate. These are the places of commonality that enable us to work together in a very meaningful way.
Thank you. And I remember about that analogy of the black snake in the river. And I think one of the amazing things about the workshop was that there was so much openness from everyone to talk about the concerns and the hopes that everyone had that made that engagement really, really fruitful. So I actually want to ask all of you do you think it's too early to have these conversations, or are we at the right moment in the history of cellular agriculture to engage with all these diverse stakeholders and community groups to talk about what cellular agriculture could look like?
Yeah, so I think one of the things for me that came out of the workshop was really about this idea and thinking about this question in terms of relationships, so relationships between indigenous communities and settlers. And if you think about this question in that context, it is way too late to have these conversations, right? So it's like it's been so long, it's so systemic, it's so, our food system is built in such in a way that was very extractive and exclusionary. And so now it's like we're having these conversations because I think we have an amazing opportunity, which you kind of mentioned, to change some of those wrongs. But it's important to recognize that a relationship already exists, and it is not one that's very healthy or equal or equitable. And so I think from that context, it's too late. But I also think, and I'm hopeful from people in this room and the way that this industry is just beginning. And personally, just like as a researcher, as a scientist, I feel some of the decisions that we get to make are really building this. And so it's really exciting to think about the prospect of having these conversations too, now to build this in a different way and make decisions differently, from all the way from choosing materials or scaffolds or cell types, and recognize that we can engage with different types of people in there.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not too early. This is something that we've just learned such an immense amount from, and feel like it's just the beginning. I completely agree. It's just been a very rewarding just sequence of dialogues that I think has resonated within our entire team, and one that we just hope to deepen as time goes on.
Yeah, can I add something? The idea, I'll just go back to what I said a second ago, and that it's kind of an exciting moment of intervention in one sense, like we're planning for the future here. And I just wanted to offer a couple of just kind of learnings or reflections on this process of thinking about this exact topic over the last year or so. And some of them come from a collective of researchers based out of the University of British Columbia. It's called the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. And it's a network of folks, including Indigenous scholars and Indigenous communities in the global North and South, and some researchers there. And they've got this kind of framework that I really like that can be used to plan for if and when this industry expands and exists in a really robust way, how ethical kind of responsibility might look. And so they call it the 4 R's of settler responsibility, and this kind of applies for any sort of marginalized engagement. And they're representation, recognition, redistribution, and reparation. So just as a little model, and they get kind of progressively more responsible as you go down the list. And so you can plan to have better representation in the activities that you have. Bring marginalized community members on board, and have them part of the team, and their voices represented at the table. You could also look towards recognition of the harms that the institutions that we currently benefit from have had for those communities. And one of the more familiar kind of approaches to this that you might have already be seeing more of is the territorial recognition. Just saying, I started by recognizing we're on this land. This is colonized land. Just recognize that we benefit from that. There's a recognition of the benefit from some harms to others. So it's another kind of form of responsibility. Getting down the list is actually towards redistribution of the resources that we have towards the communities that we recognize harm that's been done to. And that can be in the form of just sharing profits or the rest of it. And then there's a step that doesn't kind of exist in the world of settler engagement, to my knowledge anyways, and that's the form of paying back colonial debt. And this is kind of more of an abstract thing, and we'll never kind of really get there, but that's the question around what would decolonization actually look like in a context like this. So I think that's a helpful model if we're going to be thinking about intervening in the way that this industry might look in the future, if we want it to be really inclusive and really actually responsive to the needs of the communities that have been excluded from the food system. We could try and bake some of those principles into the DNA of the organizations that are going to thrive in this industry. So that's a useful model. And I'll also just say one other kind of thing. It's a phrase from Potawatomi scholar Kyle White, and that's that this stuff can only move at the speed of trust. So if it doesn't matter if it's kind of a little bit late, it's obviously late. It's definitely not too early, as the folks have already mentioned. But even, it's going to take a long time to make these relationships right, to be able to respond in an ethical and accountable way. And it can only happen at the speed of trust, and you can't rush it. And there's going to be kind of refusals to participate, and that's to be expected, and all the rest of it. But it can only go as Kyle White says, is at the speed of trust. So.
I was just going to say that I think one of the concerns that people will often have is that engagement can come across as performative, and it will often be a deterrent to asking questions. And I think that what we've learned is that coming into these discussions with an openness, with a vulnerability around what we are seeking to understand and what we're seeking to work together towards, actually takes all of that off the table, and is not as scary, doesn't feel as fraught, doesn't feel like, are we using the right vocabulary, and is that really what this is about? It actually, is a way to very meaningfully communicate about this, and that's been an exceptional learning for us, and I think one way in which the responsibility was kind of put back on us in a way that I just love and was really moved by, was this suggestion that we, as a group, just codify a heart code. Like, what is it that we believe in and really seek to understand? What are our objectives truly? And that's a very difficult thing to look inward in such a way, but that's, I think, what you need to bring to these kinds of conversations. It's not having the conversations to learn all about indigenous cultures and practices. I think that for us, it's been a recognition that we actually need to learn about ourselves, and bring that to any form of engagement.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I totally agree that it's the right time to start with those conversations. And as you were saying, like, building these relationships will take time. And we all can learn from each other. And really, vulnerability is super important in this kind of conversations. So thank you for bringing that up. We have a couple of minutes for taking some questions from the audience. Should we see? That's okay. Perfect, we have it there. Let's go with the first one. Transitioning to a more just food system will require public sector engagement. What do you see as the opportunities and limitations of the private sector? Anyone?
So I'm not an expert in startups and the economic constraints around private firms investing and working in this space, but to me, the short runway and the need for profit and the rest of it can be stifling for sure. And that's just a perspective that I have as a social scientist, and definitely the engagement through the public sector is going to be necessary. That I think is obvious, and I think it points to a role for folks that are in doing research, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research in this area, to kind of find out where are the points of leverage that we can lean into for finding those policy pathways for a more just transition. So that kind of I just kind of created a role for myself here, but I think there are questions that can be asked around that, and that goes beyond the public sector or the private sector.
I mean, I think the opportunities are ones that we have been discussing, and in terms of limitations, I actually, never really thought through what a limitation could be in this sense. This could be, everything from building together to envisioning what different products we might make are, envisioning what messaging would be around this to communities that maybe we hadn't imagined. It's limiting to think about these limitations, and it's something that I actually just truly, like, none come to my mind when we think about limitations for private sector involvement in this sense.
Maybe I'll add a little more in terms of like the opportunity side. I think, as we're designing these types of products, I think it's really exciting to think about how cell ag could be beneficial to every community. And so if we start engaging with that, I think it gives the opportunity. You could have, we heard that from the VOW folks too, of just like, there's so many different types of food systems and ways that were there and that were present. And there's potentially a lot of opportunities with this type of engagement to make food that different communities really want.
Thank you. I really like this other question because that's something that we've been talking a lot about also within the team at New Harvest and the FAI team. How will CELAC actually address returning agricultural land back to indigenous owners?
This is a great question. I'll take a first. We're looking at this exact topic and thinking of, okay, if some of the land is going to be taken out of agricultural production as a result of alternative protein, what is going to happen to that land? So this is a question that we've got going in British Columbia. We're thinking specifically in the region where there's lots of dairy production, lots of cattle production. There's a framework, a legal framework there, UNDRIP, it's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and part of that is like land should be, there's a legal mechanism for finding ways to return land to the indigenous communities of that region, especially because in that region, the land is unceded. That means it was never given away in the first place through treaties or through agreements or wars. It was just kind of taken. So we're wondering, okay, there's some of that land is protected in this public policy mechanism called the Agricultural Land Reserve. And so that land in particular, if it can be taken out of cattle production, who should be first in line for getting the land back? And there's a pretty good argument to make there that it should be the indigenous communities in the region. So that is one little case example of a potential pathway for land being transferred back in response to calls for land back. Whether or not this could be expanded to other regions, other contexts, that's a good question, but we've got a bit of a case study that we're exploring.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just say that that type of policy stuff does not exist in America, really, at the national level. So I think that's, it's a different form of addressing, I guess, not necessarily the CELAG addressing, but just in general.
Yeah, I think it gives us an opportunity to start thinking about that as well. Okay, there's this another question that I've also heard quite often, and is, what's the role of economic development, job creation in a future of inclusive CELAG?
The role of, of economic development, job creation. Yeah. I mean, I think that the opportunities are twofold. One is that, in the case of salmon, if we're able to achieve our mission such that the returns every year in salmon runs are as plentiful as they used to be, this is an opportunity for for agriculture in that sense of fishing to be revived, and that honestly I think is our primary objective when we think about conservation. It's not to create new jobs in a new technology system. It's really to restore these habitats to what they used to be, and maybe even in more plentiful numbers. But the second, and it's one that we've discussed a lot and given an immense amount of thought to, is in what ways could we provide opportunities for people who do believe in creating an alternative source of seafoods and meats through the mechanisms that we're building. And I think that that's a place where inclusivity, it's a very different kind of conversation, but it's one that if we're intentional about from the beginning, those opportunities absolutely will exist. I think, we see that as any technology grows, there are opportunities for people to become part of it if that is something that the communities want. But I will say that I actually don't see that as the primary objective. I really think that it should be helping the planet heal and helping these the traditional forms of agriculture as we think of it come back. And for the people who are stewards of the planets of our rivers and oceans, I mean, if they are selling these products, they should be able to command a premium for that, for something that is a truly special product. And I mean, that's our philosophy.
I can just add one little piece to this, and that it relates to the just transition policy framework, and that's a big part of that is finding ways to retrain fossil fuel energy workers to work in a clean energy sector. So this is something that you could also be thinking about in terms of if these products are going to have disruptions in livelihoods of farmers, what resources could be directed towards retraining for those farmers? Or how could we leverage the skills that they have in terms of stewardship and knowledge of the land to be able to put that to use in a different way? So that's kind of just drawing on that just transition framework. We could plan for how do we re-educate the current workforce in the food system?
Yeah, and that brings us back to this is the right time to start talking about these so that we can think what are the needs that we need to start covering. Okay, so there's another question here about what about inclusive engagement with countries which are technologically behind, like Latin America and Africa?
The other place where outside of the U.S. where I practiced medicine was Rwanda, and there I was struck by this idea that in Rwanda, I don't think it is technologically behind. I don't see it that way. In fact, I think that when it comes to agriculture, there's, the system that exists there is so much better than what we have here. The farmers I met were people who really cared about their animals and really cared about the land. And, it was such a, it was emotional for me to see how our system, our current food system in the Western world, had evolved in such a divergent path from that. And so, a lot of the same principles could certainly exist, and maybe I'll go back to the words of Orhan Katz, that same artist. This speech of his really struck me, and he said, why would you assume that people in African nations want to eat your food? They probably don't. And I think that, recognizing that what we're trying to achieve here is a place where, is a planet where we can go back to that state, where people are stewards in the same way and really care about the planet in a similar way. I don't see this as engaging with countries that are technologically behind. I actually think that we have so much to learn from what were these traditional practices and how far we've come from that, unfortunately.
I'll just add one more thing, and the parallels that kind of, responsibility to recognize the benefits that we have at the expense of others. And the reason why you could think of some countries in the global south as technologically behind, it's because they've been deprived a lot for the benefit of the global north. So for the same exact idea of having a responsibility to engage with marginalized communities locally, you could apply that globally. The global food system is highly unequal, and so success in certain parts of the, that global system, i.e. the global north, has a responsibility to help or to support or to redistribute resources to the global south. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, and I would add something there because coming from Mexico, from the global south, I feel that there's so much to learn from those countries in the sense of the history that we've been through before. And using this technology as an opportunity to don't make the same mistakes that have happened in the past. And also thinking that there's so much to learn down there of their traditions. And for us, food is really connected to culture and tradition, and those are things that we need to understand when we want to try to implement technologies like this. So thank you, everyone, for your replies. Okay, I think we have 5 minutes more for another question. Current select startups that are highly funded are following similar trends to tech industry, very white and male. How can we provide opportunities for diverse founders?
Yeah, I mean, I think this might maybe is more of a question directed towards other entrepreneurial people in this space. But I guess I guess I would just really encourage people to go into the sciences. Like, I don't know, like in terms of being founders or like learning about this stuff, because I do think that a lot of the, at least from the scientific like side, a lot of the things that we're trying to explore are just new ways of doing things. And I think a lot of diverse types of knowledge are needed. But yeah, I don't have a great answer of exactly how we can provide that from my like academic side. But yeah, I guess I would just encourage you to not to get involved, I guess. Yeah.
I think that coming from universities right now are obsessed with EDI, right? So so institutional learning around how to improve that, there's been some progress for sure, but typically speaking, as a sociologist, we tend to see the same kind of things. Positions of privilege are predominantly white male. That's just kind of a tendency in a lot of institutions in the economy. And while there's kind of, a dedicated commitment to address that, it's not enough yet. So that's, I don't know that there's some magical response to fixing that. It's obviously been a struggle that's been happening for a long time. And you can kind of look to some universities and policy statements around how to do a better job, but I would be very critical of them if you're trying to, find best practices, because again, they're not enough. And
yeah, I mean, I agree. It starts much earlier. I mean, I don't think if we're addressing DEI at the university level when it comes to moving, into fields of science or what ultimately becomes entrepreneurial pathways. I mean, that's also too late. I think that it's really in our children that this begins. I think there certainly has been some improvement. I don't feel like it's anywhere near enough for sure. That's clear to see in our field as well. But I think that it's far earlier than the university level or high school. It needs to start at a very, very young age and providing opportunities that have greater equality from the beginning.
Just one other thing. It's also a comment just on society. So if the people that are investing in these companies and the founders and they have the privilege already to be in that position in the first place, well, there's a reason for that, and it's because that's how society currently exists and is structured. And it's a result of patriarchy. It's a result of inequality, and so it's good to point at it and recognize it. But again, this is going to be another one of those long fights, long struggle to see some difference in that. But it is just a reflection of society, in my opinion.
Yeah, I guess that goes back to dismantling the status quo that we are living currently. We have 2 more minutes for maybe another question. I like the point about performativity. How will companies be held accountable for truly contributing to equity?
That's a very good question.
I think that back to those R's, you can kind of have a bit of a framework. You can see which are more deepened engagement, which are more forms of actual what's being given up. And if nothing's being given up, then you can think of it as more performative. So are there resources being invested in this, and are people in positions of privilege sharing that privilege in economic and material terms. And I think if they're not, then they're not being accountable. And that's one way to look at it. So get towards the redistribution and the reparations, and we'll see actual, delivery and not just performativity. How do you hold them accountable? That's another question. I think that would be more of a cultural response maybe, or you can have institutions looking specifically into that to, the name and shame sort of model for the oil industries would be one example.
It is about quantifying what you're giving up, because this isn't something that companies can just gain from and call that meaningful engagement. I think there are many dimensions in which that can be described, but I think ultimately it's going to be the story about what, what we have given, what we not just what have we learned and what are we trying to do together. It's actually what have we given to claim that there has been any kind of meaningful engagement.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I think we are run out of time, so I just want to thank our panelists today for being here and for sharing all their perspectives about this, one of the biggest questions that we had in CELAC. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Amazing. I'll take the clicker. All right, my friends. Well, a lot of people have already gotten the hint and started going to lunch, which is what we have up next. But I just want to pause and reflect on the last talk a bit. I mean, this is something that is so important to this community. Again, stressing the fact that this community is willing to have these kinds of conversations about representation, about inclusion, about how we bring more people into the cellular agriculture conversation. I don't know that I can speak much to the entire range of the problem. I think we're all thinking about it, but on the subject of startups and hiring, I mean, the data are clear that diversity on executive teams and boards is strongly correlated with kicking ass as a company. And I think that's going to continue to be true. And the best way for early startups in this space, for those of you that are thinking about starting companies and being thought leaders and being on stages and being out in front of people, the best way to make that a priority moving forward is to start thinking about it now and to start measuring it now and to have conversations like this in these spaces right now. And so another huge round of applause for our panelists. I am so glad that we had this conversation. And the rest is just some, I gotta say, thank you to our sponsors, New Lab, Ginkgo Bioworks, Compassion in World Farming, Agronomics, Cult Food Science, Stray Dog Institute, International Flavors and Fragrances, Aleph Farms, and Val Food. Sponsorship enables New Harvest to keep programming 100% independent, so no money is exchanged for stage time. It heavily subsidizes student and nonprofit tickets, and it implements a no questions asked policy for people who want to break into CELAG but can't afford the cost of a ticket. So we're really, really grateful for our sponsors. And with that, I'm going to let you guys go eat. Thank you so much.